So I'm going to talk today about TERF is not a single issue movement. We're told by trans activists that their issue is simply discrimination against transgender people and that we must be kind. But the sex self-ID movement is not about ending discrimination against transgender people. Rather, it's about their demand to be treated by all of us as the sex they identify with, the sex they feel like, rather than the sex they actually are. We can't fight sexism unless we can see our sex, wrote Andrea Nobre. Feminists oppose the movement for sex self-ID because we're protecting women's rights to exist. As feminists, we have no choice but to resist this movement. Some people are confused, and others, even those who say they're our allies, cannot see the urgency for a strong response that defends women's rights against the global spread of trans ideology. I recently heard a longtime feminist activist express her absolute fury at having to pause her work to take up the fight on behalf of women opposing this movement. I feel the same way, the same fury. We point out again and again exactly how trans ideology poses a grave danger to women. I'll mention a few examples that I hope will help to clarify why we feminists must resist trans ideology. I'll very briefly describe how trans ideology threatens feminist activism in the field of domestic violence, pornography, prostitution, abortion rights, female genital mutilation, surrogacy, and yes, transhumanism. Starting with domestic violence. Abusive men dehumanize women, verbally abuse them with special words that degrade women, specifically as women. We all know those words: bitch, whore, cunt. Women are reduced to body parts by men who control and bully and hit us. Trans activists have also reduced women, but even further. They've reduced women to a sex stereotyped costume of underwear, makeup, and fake breasts. Trans activists allege that to be feminine is to be sexually abused and physically harmed. These ideas are in direct opposition to the women's movement to end domestic violence. The rage of trans activists against TERFs is the same rage we see in batterers and controlling men. Women's spaces that refuse entry to men are a special threat to the controlling man because there she receives a unique support from other women. Just as battered women who spoke out were labeled crazy or man-hating, so also women who associate with feminists who critique transgenderism, or who are even sympathetic to feminists who critique gender ideology, those women are themselves suspect, and they can be branded transphobic just because of their association with us. It's an attempt to keep women isolated from each other, to undermine our solidarity as feminists. I recently read the expression cry bully. Cry bullies are men who are controlling, abusive, and who allege that nothing in the world is more important than their feelings. I always appreciate the work of Genevieve Gluck, and she located this recently on Reddit. This is a comment from a blog written by a man who identifies as trans. He wrote, "I have this extreme jealousy, almost anger toward my cis coworker. She's everything I want to be and more. She has a gorgeous, feminine, childlike face, small, delicate hands and feet. She's small and skinny, but somehow still has boobs and a butt. She constantly smells so good and feminine. Her hair is so long and shiny. Everything about her is ultra feminine. It triggers the fuck out of me whenever I have to interact with her. I cannot stop hating this girl, even though she's super sweet and talented. I have dreams where we wake up and our bodies are switched. She cries and screams when she realizes she's no longer in her body, but in mine. My big, awkward body that will never look feminine or attractive. I get so much joy from knowing that I took her body away from her and she's stuck in mine. I just can't get over how unfair it is. She was so blessed with looks and femininity deep down. I hate this girl. I daydream about doing bad things to her, and it scares me. I would never actually do anything in real life, but the way she inflicts so much pain on me by making me feel so ugly, worthless, and masculine sends me into a fucking rage. This rage of a man who identifies as a woman is exactly the same as the rage of men who batter and sometimes kill women. The final sentence he writes summarizes it. I can't shake this feeling of being wronged by her existence and needing to get revenge. TERF is also a movement in opposition to pornography. Feminists have long opposed the normalization of sexual violence in pornography, which, as we know, promotes a rape culture. We've campaigned to convince men to stop using pornography and to educate people about porn's lethal sexism. We've shown how pornography is linked to sexual aggression and prostitution. Women whose photos are taken while they are being purchased for sexual use, raped, and humiliated. These women are forced by porn pimps to smile and say they like it. This is poison for women in the sex trade. But advocates of sex self-ID and transgenderism support porn, study it, and mimic it. Their advocacy and imitation of pornography directly opposes feminist activism against pornography. Men who self-ID as women often use women in pornography as role models. There's extreme sexual objectification and degradation in the porn genre of sissy porn or forced feminization porn. In sissy porn, men are forced to become women by wearing women's underpants, by being sexually humiliated and subordinated by more dominant men in rituals that are a lot like fraternity hazing or boot camp humiliation. Sissy porn normalizes the eroticized, violent subordination of men by other men. A man who identified as a woman and learned about being female from watching pornography explained, getting fucked makes you female because getting fucked is what female is. This pro-porn activism of trans activists is the antithesis of feminist activism. So let me say a few things about prostitution, which, as we know, is completely linked to pornography. It's a genre of prostitution and porn are almost the same thing, only difference is a camera in the room. Prostitution, pornography, and sex self-ID are rooted in toxic stereotypes about femininity and masculinity. Feminists oppose prostitution, and we don't consider it to be work. Instead, we understand prostitution to be a last-ditch economic survival maneuver in a sexist and racist world. The sex trade is women's performance of sexual subordination to men. Men who self-ID as women perform a sexist stereotype of femininity, including a performance of the toxic stereotype of the degraded whore. Advocates of sex self-ID normalize the sex trade because prostitution and pornography validates their view of women as sex objects. Most men who ID as women are sexually aroused by being treated like a sex object, a submissive, a bitch. Today, political activists have merged sex work is work with trans women are women, and sex self-ID campaigners view decriminalized prostitution as integral to their rights. I want to talk briefly about how abortion and reproductive rights are opposed in profound ways by the transgenderism movement. Feminists have fought for the right to decide when we will or will not be pregnant. We're called transphobic and unkind if we point out that only women can have babies. Opposing biology, trans ideology alleges that men can be pregnant. Planned Parenthood, abortion clinics, and even medical journals have become trans cult fanatics to the point that they don't use the word pregnant women anymore. Instead, they refer to us as cervix havers or vagina havers. This is a psychotic level of gaslighting. This delusional language interferes with our struggle for women's reproductive rights. How can we promote women's right to obtain an abortion if we don't acknowledge the biology of pregnancy? It's impossible. Female genital mutilation is another area that is being encroached on by the spread of global gender ideology. Trans activism has interfered with our commitment to end the sexist cultural practice of female genital mutilation, or FGM. In Wyoming, in the US, sex self-ID activists tried to repeal a law that prohibited FGM. Why? Because they feared that it would interfere with their own genital surgery. Again, they wanted to stop the practice, a law prohibiting the practice of FGM, because they wanted to be sure they could obtain their own castration, genital modification, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the good news is that attempt to repeal the law failed, and the law protecting women from FGM remains in effect. Let me talk for a sec about surrogacy. Surrogacy is a practice that has been described as reproductive trafficking. It's opposed by feminists. The practice of surrogacy interferes with the work of feminists who seek to make women's childbearing experiences safer. To the surrogacy pimps, womb rental has been named, and I quote, third-party reproductive arrangements privileging multi-party medical decision-making. What the heck is that? That's lawyer speak gaslighting. Surrogacy is framed as progressive because wealthy single people or gay men obtain children via surrogacy. The United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, supports surrogacy as equivalent to adoption. Like many UN agencies these days, they've gone off the rails in terms of feminism and expressing a commitment to women's rights. Thankfully, we have the report of Reem Al-Salam, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Children, that counters some of the misinformation and distortions about prostitution. If you haven't read that report, somebody at this conference is going to know how to get a hold of it, and I urge you to read it. It's invaluable. And she does mention surrogacy in it. Men who self-ID as trans women who do not have a uterus and who want a child may seek a surrogate birth mother. Women who self-ID as men who do have a uterus but may not want to use it for birthing a child may also seek a surrogate birth mother. The birth mother is called a gestational carrier. This name denies her humanity by commodifying her and ignoring the fact that she is a medical patient with a high-risk pregnancy. This commodification, along with the enforced altruism, the costly surrogacy, the costly fertility treatments, and the purchasing parent's strong desire for children. All of these factors result in an underestimation of the extreme health risks of multiple embryo transfers. Surrogacy involves fertility drugs whose side effects are dangerous. The long-term medical and psychological consequences of egg harvesting and surrogacy are unknown. Physicians and lawyers in surrogacy agencies often do not follow medical guidelines. For example, one report found that in most cases, the number of embryos transferred into the womb of the birth mother exceeded medical guidelines. So I'm going to end my comments by mentioning transhumanism as part of the spread of global sex self-ID ideology. It's often left out, but I think it's important to consider it here. Especially in the light of the security breach that resulted in software going down in hospitals, airports, and all over the world. Transhumanists believe, and it is a belief system, that all technology is good, that uniformity is the answer to inequality. It's a deeply misogynist cult focused on longevity, control of reproduction, and control of consciousness. Posthumanism, their Shangri-La, posthumanism will be realized, they assume, by a combination of big banks, big tech, and big pharma. This movement is not to be underestimated. The biotech industry, gene splicing, and medical robotics are part of a desire to control nature and, of course, to control women's reproduction. Martine Rothblatt is a man who IDs as a lesbian and who wrote a book titled From Transgender to Transhuman. Rothblatt believes that human consciousness can be built into robots and that sexual identity can be liberated from genitals and from flesh itself. So throwing out biological reality via the worship of technology is not good for women or for the human species. It's a male supremacist, data-driven attempt to determine what is best for life on Earth. It's anti-feminist to its core.